Discovering Alabama is a production of the Alabama Museum of Natural History.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have been out for a long walk in the woods this morning, a long quiet walk. Saw a lot of interesting creatures. Whoa, let me ask you, you guys like snakes? Yeah? All right, well, let me ask you this. Who can tell me what is the largest snake native to North America? Huh? Anaconda, no. All right.
The king cobra.
The king cobra, no.
Python.
Python, nope, not the python.
Burmese python.
Oh, it's not a Burmese python either. All the snakes you mentioned are really big, but none of those are native to North America. They aren't naturally supposed to be in our part of the world. And unfortunately, the largest snake that is from our part of the world disappeared from Alabama landscape a long time ago. The largest snake native to North America used to make its home right here in our state. For thousands of years it roamed the sandy soils of the longleaf forests of South Alabama. And then, way back in the 1950s, it disappeared. The largest snake in all of North America used to live here, and then it was gone. Think about that. 2 whole generations of kids never got to see the largest snake in all the land. But guess what? I want you to come along with me because we're going to meet the largest snake native to North America. Today we're going to meet the eastern indigo snake.
This program is about a land unknown to many people, a land that in many ways has maintained its native natural wonders, a place of bountiful backcountry, forests, streams, and wildlife more diverse than can be found in much of the inhabited world. Come along with me as we explore the wild wonders of this land. Come along as we discover Alabama.
Welcome to Discovering Alabama, and welcome to the Discovering Alabama Theater here at Woodland Forest Elementary School. Woodland Forest is a Discovering Alabama model school, and as you can imagine, a Discovering Alabama school takes full advantage of the outdoor classroom. So, it may seem strange to be bringing you an account of the largest snake native to North America from inside a classroom, but as you will soon see, the remarkable past, present, and future of the eastern indigo is more than just a story about a really big snake. This is one of those stories that our children will tell their children, and there will be new tellings for generations to come. It is a tale of tragedy and triumph. It is a fable with a classic moral. It has all the mystery of myth and legend, yet it is by all accounts true. The story of the eastern indigo unfolds like a fairy tale. And like any good fairy tale, it begins in an enchanted forest. They say it was the largest ecosystem under one canopy of trees in the history of the world. One tree, the southern longleaf pine, dominated the landscape for some 90 million acres. Yes, there are larger ecosystems. Never, though, has there been one like the longleaf system. From Virginia down through the Carolinas, Georgia and Florida, across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and on into Texas, longleaf stood tall and proud over our southern lands. Beneath the emerald canopy there flourished what is now recognized as the most biologically rich ecosystem in North America. One of the unique features of this enchanted forest is that its wealth of biodiversity is found near ground level. Even the lord of the forest lives along the ground. The eastern indigo snake. Its scientific name, Drymarchon cooperi, means lord or ruler of the forest. And no doubt this magnificent creature reigned for thousands and thousands of years. How is it then that many school children, and I dare say most adults, are unaware of the eastern indigo? Here is a snake that once ruled its domain, and yet we are unfamiliar with it. How does that happen?
We've got a museum record of a snake from the early 1950s, which was the last individual known from Alabama, and it was right at the outskirts of the Conecuh National Forest.
By the 1930s, most of the Conecuh National Forest was completely cut over, really devastated. Man came in and really just cut it all down. And since then, people have really begun to understand how important that ecosystem is and have done a lot of replanting of longleaf and a lot of prescribed burning, and we've seen a lot of the rare plant and animal communities respond to that management in a positive way.
It's sort of an interesting situation that we're talking about a habitat that used to be incredibly common. More than likely, the species, the animal species that are dependent on it, most of those were also very common. And so not just the indigo snake within its range, but animals that we know that are also dependent on that habitat type, like gopher tortoises. Those species are now of conservation concern, and by all accounts from the 1800s, those were not rare species. They were not uncommon, and it has to do with the fact that longleaf pine and all those associated plant species, hundreds of them, were common over the whole landscape.
No one can say with certainty when the last eastern indigo disappeared from the Alabama landscape. No one can say with complete certainty why the last eastern indigo disappeared from Alabama. One thing we can say with certainty is that 2 generations of Alabamians have not had an opportunity to know the eastern indigo. That just doesn't seem right. But there is good news. Good for the eastern indigo snake, and good for all of us who love Alabama as a very special place.
For this project, this is an important day. It was around the late 50s when, to the best of our knowledge, we lost the indigo snake in Alabama. The last documentation of the snake was in 1954 from an area not far from here. In the 1970s, Dr. Dan Speake came along, and he had an interest in snakes, and particularly the indigo snake. Dr. Speake has done quite a bit of work on the indigo snake, and a partner emeritus with us, because he's been very helpful in letting us use his notes, answering questions, giving us his advice. But Dr. Speake was concerned about the snake, and he established a breeding program at Auburn and raised a large number of snakes and released snakes widely across the southeast and in Alabama. And one of his release sites is not far from here. Even with all the work that went into this, as far as we can tell, none of the populations were really took hold. And this was kind of brought out 2005 and 6 when Mark Sasser got together with Dan Speake, and they went roaming around all these places where Dr. Speake had released snakes. And they looked for snakes, and they went out during the best times to look for snakes and in the best habitats, and they did not find any indigo snakes. This particular project began when we at the Alabama Natural Heritage Program were approached by Mark Sasser to consider whether or not we would like to be involved with an Eastern Indigo reintroduction project. And we said yes.
On June 16, 2010, Dr. Dan Speake released the first of 17 eastern indigo snakes in the Conecuh National Forest, just outside of Andalusia, Alabama.
I've always been interested in snakes since I was a kid, and that was one of my hobbies, and I got particularly interested in, fascinated with the ecosystem around gopher tortoise burrows and hole in the sand hills, where a lot of things depend on that ecosystem, like the diamondback, eastern diamondback, indigo, several other species of snakes and other animals. And well, we just fooled with them. We went around and caught them, and were interested in them and tracked them and tried to find out why they were abundant in certain places in Georgia and why they were rare other places, and looking at the habitat and so forth, we figured out a lot of that. It was just a matter of being interested and liking the snakes and that sort of thing. It was just sort of a personal interest. It was scientific. We learned some scientific things, but it wasn't just that.
So this is a good mean one, right?
Oh, yep, just for you.
Biggest.
Yeah, she's actually she's pretty good. She's just big.
And when I got to Auburn, Dr. Speake was still finishing up the indigo snake work. So there's something of a sort of historical legacy. We're very pleased in my lab to be picking up where he left off. This is a really interesting project. We've got a very influential predatory organism that's missing from this part of the world that we would like to put back. And we're trying to, as with all of these types of projects, piece together whatever information we can to try and make this project succeed in repatriating, repopulating this particular organism in this part of the world. So my lab's participation has been to try and provide the graduate student research that will be done to help understand what happens when we do these types of projects.
So we get snakes from Georgia, the gravid females. These are females with eggs. We keep them until they deposit the eggs. We then rear those eggs. We have incubators that keep them at the appropriate temperature till they hatch out. And at this stage, we then take them to Zoo Atlanta, where they grow them for another year. And then once they're a 2-year-old snake, we take them back, put radio transmitters in them, keep them for a month to make sure they look like they're doing okay, and then release them and try and follow them for as long as we can.
The reason that we waited a year for the release was because of their size. We wanted to give them a greater advantage. For these snakes, their greatest advantage in the wild is their size. They are not constrictors, nor are they venomous. So size is the greatest advantage that they have for survival. However, we also ran into a situation where they were not large enough, some of them, to insert a transmitter into safely so that we could track them and follow them. So rather than divide the group so that we could release them all at once, we waited to release them all at one time, put a little more growth onto them, give them a greater size advantage, and put transmitters in all of them.
Just to fill in a few blanks, this big fence here, if you don't know what that's all about, for these types of projects, early on, folks who do repatriation, repopulation projects would simply go to a place and let the animal go. So essentially you're dumping it in the environment and saying, we hope you make it. And there's been a series of studies that have been done recently to suggest that if you put an animal in a pen so that it has to learn the habitat and maybe settles down and doesn't just take off, that might enhance your ability to repopulate areas. And so we're going to attempt that with this particular organism. So some of the releases will be inside of these pens, others will be outside of the pen. We've got radio transmitters in these these snakes, so we'll be able to follow them to see where they go, and we're going to test this idea of whether if you just dump them out in the environment, do they make a beeline looking for some place that they think they know might be out there but haven't bumped into yet, or whether we're better off to put them in these types of a pen environment. I want every one of you to mark down 10 years from now in your calendar. We're going to come back here, and the goal is to find an indigo snake in this part of the world that doesn't have one of our pit tags in it, which we then would know have been born in this part of the world, and that would be personally my measure of success for this project.
All right, today we are releasing captive bred or captive raised indigo snakes onto Conecuh National Forest. And this particular snake is nearly 2 years old and looks like it's about 3 feet long. The release is a very simple process. We pick a spot that we think is favorable for the snake and simply place it on the ground and allow it to begin to explore its surroundings and then just select where it wants to go. And now these snakes have a radio transmitter in them, so that we have a graduate student who will be out following these snakes. Each snake has an individual frequency, and so each individual snake can be radio tracked over time. Perhaps when I release this snake, it'll begin to nose around and actually probing the substrate with its snout, looking for an opening, a burrow, or some place to go under, or if the leaf litter is dense enough, it'll just go right under the leaf litter. Okay. And I've got it by the tail just a little bit, and you can see how the snake it's moving around, it's beginning to examine its surroundings. Here it is going under leaf litter. Of course, it may also just move a good distance away in order to, because we're kind of a disturbing presence to it, and so it may move away before it begins to slow down a little bit.
My project is based on tracking these snakes. The data that we're gathering will hopefully allow us to use a science-based model to predict both the survivability of these snakes as they get released and allow us to hopefully determine what methods are best employed to effectively release the snakes and have a good survivalship, which will allow hopefully reproduction to occur if the snakes, there are enough snakes in a particular area and they live long enough. Ideally, they will get together and reproduce and produce offspring, which is the ultimate goal of the project.
I've been radio tracking the snakes since their first release, and I'm studying what habitats they're using. So I'm interested in both the larger forest type, but also the smaller shelter type, to see really whether they're using habitat in the same way that they are in wild populations in Georgia that have been studied, because that's very important for us to understand what's happening with the reintroduced population. These snakes went from Tupperware, essentially, hatched in the lab and into the wild, and we really didn't know whether they would use habitat in the same way that they are in the wild. And it turns out so far that they are. They're, as it's been studied in Georgia populations, they're very closely tied to gopher tortoise burrows for shelter and are very closely tied to the longleaf forest and the wetlands.
The indigos depend on, in this latitude, on sand hills, and the gopher tortoise burrows in the sand hills. They don't hibernate like other snakes in this area during the wintertime. They depend on those deep burrows to stay alive during our cold weather up this far north. Now down in Florida and South Florida and so forth, they don't need gopher holes to survive, but up here they do. And diamondback rattlesnakes and indigo snakes, they all inhabit the gopher burrows together, with a lot of other animals.
You already did. No, I didn't. I'll fix it.
I told you.
All right, Carrie. Say bye-bye. Come out. Go out with him, sir.
Watch out for copperheads in there.
All
There
right.
you go. Now.
The keystone species in a situation like that is considered to be the gopher tortoise. And the gopher tortoise provides homes or refuges for up to 400 species of other animals. They all they're lying on that gopher tortoise burrow, and then they are adapted to do the living in the gopher tortoise burrow.
Despite the fact that these particular snakes, since they came from Tupperware and were hatched in the lab, had never seen a gopher tortoise burrow, the very first winter, they all went straight to one and started using it, just like they do in the wild. The majority of our snakes seem to really depend on those deep holes in the ground.
There's over 1,000 non-game species in Alabama, and every one of them is very important in the ecosystem. Just because you don't hunt it and take it home and dress it and put it in the frying pan doesn't mean it doesn't have a value as a part of our wildlife heritage. And that's what we're trying to promote and teach, that these species all have a place in the ecosystem and serve a valuable role. If you're managing for quail, for instance, you're also doing excellent red-cockaded woodpecker habitat and gopher tortoise habitat and indigo habitat. So it's all tied in together. When you manage for one species, you're managing for a wide array of species, both game and non-game species. With up to 400 species sharing space with the gopher tortoise, you can imagine some interesting partnerships forming down in that burrow. At the risk of overstretching the metaphor, partnerships are vital to the restoration of the eastern indigo in many ways.
Can you kiss it, Jimmy?
She might give you a nice little kiss.
We're not spending hunting and fishing license money for the recovery of the indigo snake. This is money dedicated for imperiled species. And the big thing about this project is how all the partnerships that have grown from this, and so much involvement with Georgia DNR, Project Orion. Now, then we picked up Zoo Atlanta, wanted to be part of the husbandry program, help with raising the snakes in captivity, and it just blossomed and to any far exceeded our expectations.
The Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Auburn University, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Zoo Atlanta, the Fort Stewart Army Base.
To continue the analogy, even as the gopher tortoise is a keystone species in the longleaf ecosystem, there is what you might call a keystone partner among the supporters of the eastern indigo. Well, after we had been started maybe 6 or 8 months, that was when the organization Project Orion, now called the Orion Society, came along and had a strong interest in indigo snake recovery, and as well as helping to fund some of these projects, and they became a partner with us.
The Orion Society, the eloquent and somewhat unusual name, comes from a young girl who had the opportunity to hold an eastern indigo snake. Her fascination with this magnificent creature led her to ask her father to do something to help save the species from extinction.
This young girl's father provided the seed money to create a conservation organization dedicated to making Orion's dream a reality.
We're a nonprofit wildlife conservation organization that's focused on conserving the world's rare reptiles and amphibians. We were founded, and our largest program by far is focused or based on the eastern indigo snake and conserving this animal range-wide. We have a variety of programs. We're actively purchasing property to create an indigo snake preserve in South Georgia. We have a number of research, inventory, and monitoring projects and programs that are ongoing. But a big part of what we do is captive breeding and reintroduction. It's a big focus and something that we think is very, very important. And we plan on continuing to work in Alabama, continue to work with Auburn and the state and all of the partners. But for us, reintroducing indigo snakes we have a region-wide perspective on it. We have a number of sites in Florida, the Panhandle of Florida as well. And we hope that someday we will again have a landscape where indigo snakes are traveling through the forest and hunting for snakes and rodents and all of those types of things. And that will be success for us, the range-wide restoration of this animal.
It does sound a bit like a fairy tale, doesn't it? A young girl in an enchanted forest seeks to rescue the ruler of the forest. But any good tale has to have a moral. There has to be some value in the story.
Obviously, the overall value is to have such a big and important predator within the natural landscape that is out here, and it creates that powerful predator creates a balance that needs to be restored to this ecosystem.
Balance. In many ways, it's a question of balance that defines our new age. We hope to balance work and family. We hope to balance our diet. We pray that our politicians will find balance.
Some believe the whole world hangs in the balance. Many physicists believe that at the essence of our very universe is a symmetry, a harmonious balance.
As a top predator, the indigo helps bring balance back to the web of life of an Alabama longleaf forest. And it strikes this balance in a most interesting way.
These snakes prey on large venomous snakes as their primary food. And in their absence, without any sort of regulation or control, the venomous snakes, the large venomous snakes like rattlesnakes and copperheads and water moccasins, go unchecked because there are very few predators of these snakes out in the forest. And so to restore their main predator and their main check and balance system back into the ecosystem in a way allows us to hopefully regulate the population of these snakes that are often, feared and misunderstood. So it is a positive in the eyes of many people where, snakes are not an easy sell. A lot of people are frightened of snakes, and rightly so, because some of them are dangerous. But this snake will help us to hopefully restore a balance within the ecosystem and the natural predator-prey relationships that occur out here.
So far, we've had a really positive response from the local community. People have tended to know that king snakes and indigo snakes are what they would call good snakes. I think all snakes are good, but even people who are really afraid of snakes and harbor all that fear recognize these as species that are good to have around their house and their farm. They will actually go to some trouble to avoid them if they're out on their tractors. And a lot of people have been really excited. There are a lot of encounters in our area with venomous snakes, and people are pretty excited about the idea that putting the indigo snake back into Alabama may reduce some of these dangerous encounters that they have on their own land.
The eastern indigo snake is a non-venomous snake that eats venomous snakes. But you don't have to take my word for it.
We let it go down. The very first morning we come out, I get to the release site, I turn on the scan mode on my receiver, and I pick up a pretty good signal, which is a good sign. Track the snake down. It took about 10 minutes to track the snake to its exact location. When I got there, I noticed that the snake was on top of the ground and was eating a 3-foot-long copperhead, which is a venomous species found commonly in this area. So it was a pretty exciting morning for the first snake to be found, both to be on top, to be able to see it, and also eating a venomous snake is a wonderful sign and a great way to start the project.
The eastern indigo may enjoy a tasty copperhead, but that's not to say it's a picky eater.
The indigo snake is adapted to feeding on almost anything that moves that he can get his mouth around. I caught a 7-foot indigo snake one time at Fort Stewart, Georgia, and he regurgitated the remains of a hognose snake, a baby gopher tortoise, and a pygmy rattlesnake that he'd eaten.
When the indigo snake hatches out, they're a pretty large snake as far as a baby snake goes. So they can handle most other snakes that are, a year old. And that's what they tend to go for in the wild, is they go for, lizards, anything of that same shape. You'd be amazed what they could really just chew down and swallow. They are generalists. They'll eat just about anything. They'll eat frogs. They're not constrictors like a lot of colubrids are. A lot of other snakes, like king snakes or rat snakes, tend to constrict their prey. These guys crawl right up to it. Say they crawl up to a rattlesnake, they'll just crawl up to the rattlesnake, grab it by the head, and swallow it down. They have pretty strong jaws, to where they can eat. Once they're bigger, they can crush a rattlesnake's skull. But generally, they just swallow the thing down without even bothering to kill it.
And so we come to the conclusion of our story, a time to turn the page as we wonder, does this tale have a happy ending?
We feel that even at an early age, this project has been highly successful. We've documented that we do have survival of the snakes, so every year that we release snakes, percentage of those snakes are surviving. That's very successful. We've also documented reproduction out in the wild. So the snakes that we are releasing are reproducing, or at least, they have the opportunities to reproduce. And those are really the two big keys to a reintroduction project, is both having the animals that you reintroduce into the population survive and reproduce.
I'm cautiously optimistic, I put it that way, because I believe that the public is becoming increasingly aware of the importance of these animals, and I believe they'll become increasingly younger, especially the younger generation, is going to be more protective of the natural heritage than the older generation has. I hope so.
Check the data sheet for the pen we're in and make sure he's supposed to be in this pen, just for sure. Double check.
It depends on the day and the situation as to whether I want to be real optimistic about having enough land left in the southeast when I die, as opposed to whether we will lose some of these species, because it's a complex social and political issue, and it just requires constant attention, effort, and ongoing education.
Oh, we live in a state with this incredibly rich amphibian and reptile diversity. I think that the horizon now for restoring sort of old-growth landscapes is the wave of the future. And I see a horizon where we might get old trees back with all of these things that we're trying to put back, like an indigo snake, could be done effectively.
You know, we've been talking about the biology and the ecology and such of what's going on here, but there's also a cultural aspect to this because people occupy these forests. And at least a couple of generations of Alabamians have not had the opportunity to experience seeing an indigo snake in the wild. And that's something we're now giving back, not just to Alabama, but to, you know, to everyone.
We're seeing more and more people, I think nowadays, that are more educated and concerned about imperiled species and bringing a lot of these species back. I guess the one message that I would have is folks should investigate more and not just accept the facts as they may have believed at one time, but research this. And that's really how the Indigo Snake Project really got started, from one little girl researching indigo snakes and challenging her father to do something about it. And he hadn't developed Project Orient, and that's why this project has kind of got on the fast track, because we had a private donor that was willing to cut through the red tape and get things started. And it really jump-started this project from that little girl's interest in snakes.
Okay, as promised, we're going to meet the eastern indigo snake. And we have a guest with us today, a Miss Kay Stone, longtime dear friend of mine, longtime advocate for nature, and she's got a few very interesting critters along with her today. And let me help her get those ready, and we're going to have the show ready to go.
I brought a very special friend with me today, and his name is Blue, and he is an eastern indigo snake, and I think you all just learned some cool facts about him. And he's the largest snake native to North America. Of course, he's not. He's only about 2 years old, going on 3 years old, so he's got a lot of growing to do. But they're so cool because they have such neat scales on them. He is not venomous. One of his favorite foods is venomous snake. They eat copperheads and rattlesnakes. And so not only are they very good for the environment because they eat other things like rats and stuff, but they also eat snakes that are harmful to us. And they used to be very prevalent and live in South Alabama, and for a lot of reasons, their populations declined. And Auburn University and a lot of partners, including folks up here in Tuscaloosa, have helped us reintroduce them down in South Alabama. And this gentleman I have special permits to be able to bring him to a school and talk to groups like you so that you all can learn more about appreciating the wonderful wildlife of our state. And while you might never see an indigo snake in the wild up here, you may see other snakes that are not venomous, and we want you to understand that they're a very important part of our ecosystem. So would anybody like to volunteer to come up? Okay, John, you had your hand up. Okay. Now this snake has not been handled a lot, although he was hatched in our lab. We collected eggs, and in partnership with Zoo Atlanta and the Orient Society, we have been raising them Some of them get a transmitter, and it's placed into their body, under their skin, and then we release them into the wild, and we have people, graduate students, who go out and track them and try to see what they're doing once they're released. Some of them stay very close to where we release them, and others travel long distances, miles and miles, just because they're looking for the right habitat that they feel comfortable in. Would you like to come up? Would you like to hold him? There you go. Now just very gently, let him move. He won't hurt you. These are very docile animals, and there is another reason that we've lost them in the wild a lot, is because people wanted them as pets. And another thing about these eastern indigo snakes is they love all types of food. They will eat baby birds, they will eat frogs, they'll eat baby turtles. They're just very opportunistic when they feed. One of the favorite places to hang out are in gopher tortoises' burrows. In the area where they're native, there's sandy soil, and the gopher tortoise digs these nice long burrows. And in the hot summers in South Alabama, these guys don't want to get too hot, so they crawl down into that burrow and hang out because it's cool underground. And in the wintertime, when it's cold outside, they might crawl down into that burrow and stay warm, because they will actually get in there with a gopher tortoise and hang out. There you go. You okay? He's tickling you, wasn't he? Yeah, he was. Well, here you go. You hold it. You got him. There we go. He's yours. Now, let him move. He's not going to hurt you. Not going to hurt you. There we go. Let's get his head up there. Now, let him move. Hold him up. He wants to be supported. He's just exploring. There you go. There you go. Don't move. He's not gonna hurt you. One of the things that has happened that we've noticed in the part of the state where these animals used to live is we have a lot more copperheads. And copperheads are venomous snakes, and they can bite a human and cause a lot of pain. And these guys like to eat them, but because these guys were taken out of that ecosystem, the other species of snakes, like copperheads and rattlesnakes, have actually increased in population. Rattlesnakes have not so much because they also are hunted, but copperheads, we've noticed an increase in population because of that. He and your Jack are about the same color. He uses that tongue, and he's actually tasting the air, and he can take that tongue, and there's an organ in the roof of his mouth, and it tells him that whatever he's tasting or smelling using his tongue is a food item. And once he does, he will kind of stalk it and bite it, and once he bites it, then he will eat it whole. You might wonder why that tongue is forked, and the reason their tongues are forked is so that they can use it to tell left and right. So if he smells that mouse over here, he knows to go this way. If he smells that mouse over there, he can go that way.
Discovering Alabama is a production of the Alabama Museum of Natural History, the University of Alabama. This program is supported by grants from the Solon and Martha Dixon Foundation, the Alabama Wildlife Federation, working for wildlife since 1935, and the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, State Lands Division.